My father looked me in the eye and said, his voice as cold as ice, "You were never my daughter." I was only 12. The kitchen was silent, and my mother simply lowered her head, as if this were something she'd expected to hear. The knife he held was slicing carrots, but it might as well have cut my heart. Everything inside me froze. Those words didn't seem to come from a human being. They seemed like a sentence. From that day on, I knew there was something broken in our family, something no one wanted to talk about. I tried to understand what I had done wrong, why my own father rejected me like that. He didn't yell, he just ignored me. Silence was the greatest violence. My mother would say, "He just needs time." But the years passed, and time only hardened the wall between us. I began to observe every gesture, every look, trying to find a clue. Did I look different from my brothers? Did he know something no one else was telling me? My childish heart couldn't bear the constant doubt. Rejection shaped me, made me anxious, insecure. I cowered close to him, hoping for any crumb of affection that rarely came. The nights were worse. I'd burrow under the covers, trying not to cry out loud so my mother wouldn't hear. I'd write in a hidden notebook, as if there I could talk to someone who understood. Why doesn't he love me? Was the question I asked myself most often, and no one had the courage to give me an answer. I started to believe I was the problem. I changed the way I dressed, the way I spoke, and I started behaving like a robot, trying to please him. But it was no use. He kept looking at me like I was a mistake, and yet, a part of me still loved him. Or maybe I just desperately wanted to be loved by him. Share this story to reach further. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. Transition. I thought that with time, things would change. That maybe one day he would look at me with love. But what I didn't know was that the hole in my chest came from a buried truth. A truth that would only surface many years later, inside a hospital, when all seemed lost. My name is Emily. I grew up in a quiet Ohio suburb with 2 older brothers, a devoted mother, and a distant father. While my siblings received attention, gifts, and hugs, I became increasingly invisible. It always felt unfair, but no one talked about why. It was as if there was an unspoken rule in that house. I was the exception. My mother was the kind of woman who carried the world on her shoulders with a smile on her face, but behind her tired eyes, there were secrets. When I asked why Dad was like that to me, she'd look away. "He's complicated," she'd say. But deep down, I sensed she knew much more than she was letting on. Between her and my father, there was a silent tension, as if they lived a pact of silence. My brothers, Ethan and Josh, treated me well, but they never intervened. Maybe they thought it was normal. Maybe they thought I deserved it. The oldest, Ethan, tried to protect me from time to time, but it was clear he, too, feared our father. Josh, the middle brother, simply ignored me as if he'd been trained to do so. I was the annoying presence, the noise outside the music. At school, I tried to hide everything. I made up stories about my father, saying he was funny, that he took me on walks. The truth was the opposite, but no one needed to know. I lied to protect my pain, as a way to keep it from swallowing me whole. Rejection didn't leave scars on my body, but it tore me apart inside. Little by little, I grew up trying to be perfect. Better grades, better behavior, no mistakes. I thought that maybe if I were perfect, he would notice me, that one day he would look at me with pride. But the harder I tried, the further he seemed to pull away, and the feeling that something was wrong with me grew deeper, day by day. It was on my 15th birthday that everything started to go downhill. While my siblings received parties, expensive gifts, and emotional speeches, my day passed by as if it hadn't happened. My mother gave me a simple cake, but my father didn't even appear in the kitchen. When I asked where he was, she simply replied, "He's had a rough day." I've had rough days my whole life. That day left a deep impression on me. I began to question my own existence. If he doesn't even acknowledge me on my birthday, then who am I to him? I locked myself in my room and cried myself to sleep. No message, no gesture. I felt like a guest in that house, or worse, an intruder. And as much as it hurt, I kept smiling in front of others. I started writing more. I created stories about a girl who discovered she'd been switched at birth. It was a way to cope with the pain. In fiction, everything made more sense than in real life. And even without knowing it, perhaps I was closer to the truth than I imagined. But at the time, it was just an attempt to escape a reality that was crushing me. I became quieter, more withdrawn, not because I wanted to, but because there was no room for me in that house. My mother's pitying looks began to irritate me. If she knew the reason for everything, why didn't she tell me? I deserved to know. One day I summoned the courage to ask, "Why does he treat me like this?" She hugged me, cried, and said, "One day you'll understand." But I needed to understand right then and there. Adolescence was cruel. While my friends had fathers who attended games, performances, and graduations, mine didn't even say, "Congratulations." I grew accustomed to seeking validation in the wrong places. I dated young, got attached easily, and accepted little, all to fill a hole that grew ever wider. And yet, I still slept, hoping that one day he'd knock on the door and say, "Forgive me, daughter." At 18, I decided to leave home. It wasn't an impulsive moment. I'd been saving money on the sly for 2 years, working as a waitress and tutoring. The day I packed my bags, my mother cried so hard she could barely speak, but my father just stood up from his chair and said, "That's great, finally." It was like a final blow, but it was also the first time I felt freedom. I rented a small apartment near the college. It had little furniture, little food, but a peace I had never felt before. Without the rejecting looks, without the screaming silence. There, I began to rebuild myself. I began to understand that I wasn't the problem. The problem lay in the secrets that had surrounded me my entire life. I cut off contact with my father completely. I stopped answering calls, didn't go to family parties. Only my mother visited me occasionally, always with that same look, of someone who wants to tell me everything but can't yet. And it gnawed at me. If there's something I need to know, why won't anyone tell me? This thought became a constant echo within me. That's when I decided to investigate. I began rummaging through old documents, saved photos, and birth certificates. I found nothing out of the ordinary, but I did find a yellowed, undated letter hidden among my mother's old books. It was addressed to a man named Daniel. It spoke of a pregnancy, regrets, and forbidden love. And worst of all, it said that the girl could never know the truth. My world fell apart. Was that letter about me? Who was Daniel? And why would my mother write something like that but hide it for so long? I took a deep breath and put the letter back, without telling anyone. But in that moment, a flame ignited inside me. I needed to find out the truth, no matter what. And one thing was certain. My father knew exactly why he rejected me. And now, I would no longer accept living in its shadow. After finding the letter, I spent days reliving every detail of my childhood with new eyes. I began to see patterns, the absences, the silences, the nighttime arguments between my parents that I pretended not to hear. It was as if everything suddenly made too much sense, and it hurt. I felt like my life had been a play. I was the only one who didn't know the script. I decided to confront my mother. I showed her the letter, waited for her reaction. She turned pale, as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She tried to deny it, stammered, cried, but it was too late. I deserved the truth. Who is Daniel? Am I his daughter? The question left my mouth with a bitter taste. My mother didn't answer immediately, but her guilt-filled eyes said it all. The next day, she texted me asking to talk. We met at a secluded cafe. Her hands trembled as she held the cup. "I love you, Emily. I always have, but I made a mistake." And then she told me that years before I was born, she had an affair with a man who worked with her, that they fell in love, but she couldn't bring herself to leave my father. She said she tried to hide the pregnancy, pretending everything was normal, that my father found out, but agreed to raise me, on one condition: he would never consider me his daughter. My mother, desperate, agreed, thinking he would change his mind over time, but he never did, and with each passing day, his presence killed any chance of me growing up truly loved. It destroyed me inside. I finally had the answer, but not peace. Knowing I'd been rejected for something I didn't choose, for a cruel pact between two adults, revolted me. I wanted to scream, run, disappear, but I also felt a new strength rising within me. I wouldn't be silent anymore. If everyone had chosen silence, I would be the voice that broke through. I spent weeks digesting everything, until I received an unexpected call. My father was in the hospital. A massive heart attack, critical condition. My hands shook. The news hit me like a punch, mixing sorrow with a hint of worry. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, that girl who always wanted to be a real daughter, still hoped for something. I went to the hospital. The nurse looked at me with confusion when she saw my name. "Are you a relative?" I hesitated before saying yes. I walked slowly into the room. He was unconscious, with machines and tubes everywhere. In that cold, white room, I looked at the man who had rejected me all his life. For the first time, I saw fragility in his face. I saw fear, and strangely, I felt pity. My mother arrived soon after. She sat beside me and held my hand. It was the first time we felt like we were there, on the same side. You deserve to know everything, Emily. And it was there, in that hospital, that she completed what she had started to say. Daniel had died in an accident shortly after I was born. She tried to shield me from the pain, from the chaos, but in doing so, she cast me into abandonment. Suddenly, a doctor called us in. My father had regained consciousness and was asking to see me. I walked into the room, my heart pounding. He looked me in the eye, and in a weak voice said, I've watched you all these years. You're not my daughter by blood, but you have more courage than I ever had. My legs nearly gave out. He continued through tears. I was a coward. I let anger take over. But seeing you here now shows me that I failed as a man. I cried. For the pain, for the anger, for the girl I'd waited my whole life to be recognized. And in that moment, something inside me broke, and at the same time, healed. It wasn't the perfect apology, but it was enough for me to begin to free myself. After that conversation in the hospital, I returned home with my head spinning. It was as if my life had been split in two, before the truth and after it. For the first time, I felt sorry for my father, not because he was sick, but because I realized how much he had imprisoned himself within his own pride. He had pushed me away for years because of something he himself chose to swallow in silence. My mother tried to reach out, as if telling the truth would finally free her from the guilt. But the rift between us remained. As much as I understood her choices, they had wounded me deeply. What hurt me most was knowing that I hadn't just been rejected by my father, I'd been betrayed by the very person who was supposed to protect me, and that would take time to heal. My brothers were also shaken. Ethan, the oldest, was the first to call me. He said he suspected something but never had the courage to ask. Josh, on the other hand, was in shock. He said he needed time, and I understood. It was a lot for all of us, but deep down, even with all the confusion, I began to feel something I'd never felt with them: belonging. The family began to reorganize around the truth. The masks fell, and despite the pain, there was a kind of relief. Conversations became more honest, more open. For the first time, I found myself sitting at the table without feeling like I was occupying a place that wasn't mine. It still hurt, but for the first time, I felt like my presence there made sense. Even with my father in the hospital, sick, and with all the emotional turmoil, I felt more alive. It was as if I had finally returned to my own body. For the first time, I didn't have to pretend. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Because the truth, however painful, gave me a chance to truly exist, without having to hide inside myself. In the days that followed, I visited my father in the hospital frequently. Each visit was a mixture of tension and trial. Sometimes he tried to talk, but other times he just stared at me, silent. I could tell he didn't know how to be my father, because he never learned, and never allowed himself to. But something inside him also seemed to want to change, even if it was late. I fought the urge to scream at him, to pour out years of pain, but something stronger made me choose the silence of understanding. It wasn't about covering up, it was about breaking the cycle. I no longer wanted to live trapped in resentment, and while he would never be the father I dreamed of, perhaps he could still be the man who saw me with humanity, even at the end of his life. During one of his visits, he held my hand for the first time. His fingers were weak, but the gesture was so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. He looked at me and said, "You deserved so much more than I was able to give." That echoed in my head for days, and while it didn't erase everything that had happened, it opened a door for something different to emerge from it. I decided to write him a letter. In it, I told him how I felt all those years. I told him about the girl who waited for hugs that never came. I told him about the nights I cried alone. But at the end of the letter, I also said, despite everything, I still wanted to be your daughter, even if only for a single moment. I handed the letter to him without saying a word. The following week, I found the letter back in my backpack. He had rewritten something on the back of the last page. "You were always my daughter. I was the one who couldn't be your father." I cried so hard reading it that it felt like a dam had broken inside me. And there, even though it wasn't completely fixed, I found the beginning of my forgiveness, not for him, but for myself. After the letter and his response, something in me calmed, but the past still haunted me. I began having recurring dreams about my childhood, scenes where I'd call out to him and he'd turn his back. I'd wake up with my heart racing, in a cold sweat. My body still held the memories of abandonment, and now that the truth was out in the open, everything felt more real, more raw. I searched for more answers about Daniel, the man who could have been my father. I found a former colleague of my mother's who confirmed everything. She said they shared an intense but forbidden passion, that he wanted to run away with her and start a new life. But my mother, fearing scandal, chose to keep the family. I was the price of that choice, and it hit me harder than I expected. I asked to visit Daniel's grave. I'd never met him, but something inside me told me I had to go. I brought him flowers, sat on the ground, and spoke to him as if he could hear me. I don't know who you were, but part of me came from you, and I only wish I'd had the chance to know you. I cried there for everything I didn't experience, for everything that could have been different, for the life I was denied. In that cemetery, alone, I understood that my mourning wasn't just for the unknown man. It was for the child I was, for the unanswered questions, for the parties without birthday wishes, for the hugs that never came. It was a mourning for lost time, but it was also the moment I chose to no longer carry that weight. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose what to do with it. I returned home feeling something new, lightness. For the first time, it wasn't pain gripping my chest. It was a melancholic but true acceptance. I no longer needed anyone's approval to feel like someone's daughter. I existed, and that, in itself, was more than I ever thought I would have. Maybe I was finally ready to move on. With everything that had happened, I began to look at myself with new eyes. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just a consequence of other people's decisions. I was a woman with a story, with scars, with strength. I wrote everything I'd experienced in a journal, trying to organize the mess that still lived inside me. Each page was a cry, a liberation. I started therapy. I talked about abandonment, silence, and the desperate search for belonging. The psychologist said something I've never forgotten. "You're not rejected. You were hurt by people who didn't know how to love." That shocked me. I'd always thought I was the problem, but now I understood that I was only carrying the consequences of other people's fears. I started to reconnect with my brothers. I told them everything I discovered, without censorship. Ethan cried with me. He said that if he had known, he would have defended me more. Josh took a while, but one day he sent me a simple message. "I'm sorry, and I love you." That broke me. For the first time, I felt like a true sister, not by blood, but by choice. My mother and I rebuilt something different. We were no longer mother and daughter in the same mold as before. Now we were two women marked by the same history, trying to find a way to love each other amidst the shrapnel. She asked me for forgiveness, and I gradually managed to forgive her. Not completely. There were still wounds. But forgiveness wasn't a favor to her. It was a healing for me. Little by little, the rejected girl faded away. In her place was born a woman with scars. Yes, but also with a voice enough to tell her story, to say, "I survived." And now, for the first time, I lived not in the shadow of rejection, but in the light of truth, a light that perhaps had always been mine. It was just hidden behind the lies of others. A few weeks later, I got another call from the hospital. My father was getting worse. This time, the doctor said he had little time left. I took a deep breath. I didn't know if I wanted to see him go, but I also couldn't bear the regret of not having gone. I packed my things and left. On the way, I remembered all the times I'd wished he'd called me daughter. I entered the room and found an unrecognizable man, frail, thin, with sunken eyes, but still with that presence that had once so intimidated me. He turned his face slowly when he heard me enter. He smiled with difficulty. "You came," he said, his voice almost muffled. I walked over and sat beside him. For a second, everything was silent, as if time had stopped. "Emily," he said, "I lied to myself for so many years, but you were always my daughter." I closed my eyes, feeling the tears fall. It was all I'd wanted to hear since I was 12. But in that moment, I was no longer the girl begging for love. I was a woman capable of offering compassion, even to those who hadn't known how to love her properly. He held my hand with what little strength he had. "Forgive me for everything, for letting my ego speak louder than my heart." I responded with just a gesture, squeezing his fingers lightly. Words failed me, but in that touch there was more than any speech. It was the goodbye of someone who understood too late what truly matters. I stayed there with him until the end. He left on a cold morning, with the light streaming through the window and illuminating his tired face. It wasn't a grand farewell, but it was genuine. And in that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The pain was still there, but something was closing. A cycle, a silence that had finally been broken. And with that, I could move on. The funeral was low-key, attended by only the closest family. My mother wept softly, her eyes red, as if reliving all the years of pain. My brothers were silent, each dealing with the loss in their own way. And I was at peace, not because of the death, but because of the truth. For the chance we had, however late, to truly see ourselves, without masks. As the coffin was lowered, I remembered the first time he'd said I wasn't his daughter, and how now, at the end, he'd found the courage to say otherwise. Life has these ironies. Sometimes redemption comes late, but still, it comes. And that's a rare gift. I accepted it, not for him, but for myself, because I deserved that peace, even if it came at the end of the story. After the ceremony, I walked alone to my car. I looked up at the gray sky and felt the wind blow on my face. There was no sadness. There was a kind of relief that only those who have carried secrets for years know. It was as if I had buried not only a father, but also all the questions that had haunted me for so long. I finally had my answers. In the following days, I began writing my story, not to expose anyone, but to free myself. Words became my refuge, my way of transforming pain into strength. With each sentence, I stitched together the wounds, and I realized that my story, however difficult, could help others. Other Emilys out there who also hope to be recognized. It was in this process that I understood. I no longer needed anyone's validation to feel whole. The abandonment hurt. The rejection left its mark. But none of that defined me. What defined me was how I chose to deal with it all. And I chose to live. I chose to love, despite what I lacked. And that choice, is what makes me finally my own version of a daughter. Over time, I realized that pain shaped me, but it didn't break me. I learned to look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed of who I am. I learned not to diminish myself to fit into tight spaces. I'm no longer the rejected daughter. I'm the woman who survived silence, lies, and absence. And that made me stronger than any approval could ever give me. I returned to my studies with greater focus, finished my degree, and began giving lectures on identity, emotional abandonment, and forgiveness. With each story I heard from the audience, I realized I wasn't alone. The world is full of children waiting for a gesture, a look, a response. And I wanted to be a voice for all those who, like me, lived in the shadow of the unsaid. I met new people, made sincere friendships, and built a genuine support network. People who saw me as I am, not because of my past, but because of the present I chose to live in. For the first time, I felt free to love and be loved, without fear, without trying to please, without feeling like I needed to prove myself. And this freedom is priceless. It's what I'm most proud of having achieved. Over time, I visited my mother again. Now, our conversations are different. She still gets emotional when we talk about the past, but there's a new lightness between us. I forgive her every time I hug her, not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I choose not to live trapped by what I can't change. Forgiveness has become a bridge, not an excuse, a path, not a prison. Today, when I think of my father, I no longer feel anger. I feel sadness for everything he lost out of pride, but I also feel gratitude, for even in the end, he said what I needed to hear. That didn't fix everything, but it gave me something I never had, closure. And sometimes, that's all we need to start over. With life moving at a different pace, I began writing a book. The story isn't just mine. It's about thousands who lived in silence, swallowing their pain. The title came easily, The Daughter of Silence. Every chapter is a cry I'd held for years. And as I put it on paper, everything began to take shape and make sense. Writing became healing, a bridge between the Emily of yesterday and the one of today. I've received messages from readers saying they felt seen for the first time. Some told me they'd also been rejected, that they'd also been told they didn't belong. And it's for these people that I keep going, because I know how much it hurts to grow up feeling like a mistake. And I know the power in hearing someone say, "You are not alone." I started giving interviews, being invited to podcasts, and participating in discussion groups. Every opportunity was a chance to transform my pain into a tool of empathy. Not to become a heroine, but to show that it's possible to break the cycle, that even when the root is wounded, the tree can grow strong. And yes, it can flourish. I met a wonderful man, unlike anything I've ever seen. Someone who isn't scared by my story, who listens to me, who respects me. With him, I learned that I don't need to hide. I don't need to ask permission to exist. And for the first time, I thought about building my own family, one where love doesn't depend on secrets, but on truth. If someone had told me years ago that I would have all this, I wouldn't have believed it. But today I know. It all begins when you choose to free yourself, and I chose. I chose to live without fear, without silence, without shame. I chose to be who I am, with all the truth I was given and with all the strength I've gained, because I am not what they did to me. I am what I chose to do with it. Today, looking back, I don't just see pain, I see construction. Every tear, every silence, every rejection was a brick in the path that brought me here. I wouldn't change a thing, because all of this made me capable of understanding what others hide. It made me sensitive to the pain of others, to absence, to the loneliness that grows silently within so many people. The girl who longed to be loved by a father is now a woman who loves herself enough to no longer beg for acceptance. I understood that belonging isn't begged for, it's built, and that blood doesn't define love. What defines it is presence, care, looking and saying, "I see you," something I've waited for my whole life. And that in the end, I learned to give myself. I carry with me the certainty that my story was not in vain. Every difficult step served to enable me to be a beacon for someone in the dark. I know that many people still experience what I experienced firsthand. And so, I say from the heart, don't be silent. Your story matters. Your pain has value. And you are not alone, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. The legacy I want to leave is not one of pain, but of overcoming. I want my life to say, without words, it is possible. It is possible to break cycles, heal old wounds, rebuild relationships, or walk away when necessary. It is possible to start over even when all seems lost. And above all, it is possible to live with truth, because the truth, however harsh, sets you free. If my father taught me anything, it was that, know to do, with a child's heart. And that has guided me in everything. I want to be different. I want to love differently. I want my children to one day never have any doubts about who they are, how much they are loved. And may they always know that no truth will be too big to hide, because where there is truth, there is love. And now that all has been said, if this story touched your heart in any way, share with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe to the channel to hear more real stories like this. Comment below where you're listening. I'll read everything with care. And remember, you have the right to be loved, and the duty to love yourself, even when the world doesn't know how.